This brings us to the last two churches in the sequence. Churches whose designs are, in fact, ones that foreground the fact that columns are now entirely absent. Remember Alberti's distinction with which we began between the notion of a wall architecture, in other words, an architecture that affirms the idea of structure, as opposed to the column, which for him remains in the realm of the decorative. This distinction prompts Wittkower to claim that the complete absence of columns in the two churches that you see here, San Sebastiano in Mantua, begun in 1460, and Sant'Andrea, also in Mantua, begun in 1462, that in these churches where columns are absent signifies a kind of decisive turning point in Alberti's project, in his interpretation of architecture writ large. With this idea, with these words, Wittkower is actually bringing us back to the terrain of syntax, of ratio, of architecture in relation to objectivity. Now, both churches were commissioned by the same patron, the ruler of Mantua, Ludovico Gonzaga. They are slightly different. In fact, San Sebastiano is a central planned church. It's a votive church, which was never completed, and what we see today is heavily restored. Sant'Andrea, by contrast, is far more complete. And in both cases, unlike the Tempio in Rimini and Santa Maria Novella in Florence, Alberti was not faced with the problem of adapting his designs to a pre-existing structure. In other words, this idea of inventing the church whole cloth means that Wittkower can analyze the facades as theoretical solutions to an architectural problem. For Wittkower, the two facades coincide as well as stand as kind of polar opposites of each other. On the one hand, if you look at them, the main proportions are essentially the same. Like Santa Maria Novella, the width corresponds to the height from the level of the entrance to the apex of the pediment. There's the enclosure within the square, once more. On the other hand, we have opposing conceptions of the facade here. San Sebastiano underscores the presence of as much solid wall as possible. It affirms the wall as principle. And this is the opposite of what we see in Sant'Andrea, where besides the enormous and deeply recessed entrance, the side bays have been broken up into three tiers of thresholds, of doors, of niches, of windows. Again, just as from the very beginning, the idea of the triumphal arch motif as a solution to masking the two-story problem of a church remains the reference here in these new churches, remains the essential antique source for the facade, as somehow the appropriate classical source for religious structure. Now, in his reconstruction of San Sebastiano, Wittkower is going to emphasize the temple facade raised on its podium again, just as we saw with the Tempio, and reached by this broad monumental stair in the antique manner, raising the church above the city fabric somehow, at least symbolically. The facade is articulated by 6 equidistant pilasters and a broken entablature with an arched window behind it. The source this time is another triumphal arch, the Arch of Tiberius in Orange. And what I've always found strange is that Wittkower fails to mention that the arrangement of elements we see on the church are actually coming from the east side of the arch, not the front. Now with Sant'Andrea, there's another arch, the Arch of Trajan at Ancona. This is what comes into play, with 1 large passage and 2 narrower bays that are also cut into 3 spaces. The argument is that while the classical temple front, with its columns and entablatures and pediment, is a reference for both churches, this time he's pushed out the inner room with its walls, the so-called cella, into the orders, abolishing any freestanding column and entablatures, and instead privileging the idea of the wall, of privileging ultimately structure over ornament. Here's Wittkower. The Tempio and Santa Maria Novella are connected, insofar as they show the compromise of wall and column, a compromise which was later abandoned. Here, the compliance with the authority of classical motifs was replaced by their interpretation in terms of a consistent wall architecture. Alberti, according to Wittkower, moved from columns and ornament to the affirmation of the wall, where we had an exploration of the ornamental meaning of classicism. Now we have moved to a structural understanding of classical antiquity. And this is what renders Alberti revolutionary in Wittkower's eyes. So to conclude, let's think about Wittkower's Alberti. For Wittkower, the four churches offer a coherent sequence. From the very beginning, we are given a problem: how to give a church, a religious edifice, a classical aspect, how to find the sources that are going to solve the problem of masking a two-story structure, and ultimately coming in the end at an aesthetic affirmation of the whole, of some ideal principle of unity. One of the dangers here, of course, is to confuse Wittkower with Alberti. We want to make sure that we understand that Wittkower's approach, which is about using diagrams to distill some kind of fundamental understanding of architecture and its elements, is about schematizing buildings. He is not going to want to address Alberti's exploration of vernacular aesthetics that are part of a far more eclectic understanding of religious architecture than Wittkower allows. However, to think about Wittkower's reading of Alberti is also to understand an approach that fundamentally looks at the diagram as the revelatory tool for understanding architecture and its development. In this sense, by using the diagram, he's actually turning to a mode of interpretation that relies on the schema. And here we can recognize, actually, an approach inspired by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who looks at the architectural imagination as the very thing that schematizes the complexity of the world and transforms it into an ideal that is presented as an objective principle or axiom to the understanding.